quarterback in the NFL, they lose their job. He was so bad, he was the worst starter, and then he wasn't a starter anymore. That's how bad he was. And they have that contract, his guy in his 5th year, who was so bad that he lost his job. And that guy has an elite contract. He has the contract of a top 5 quarterback. He has the contract of a guy who's not only supposed to not make as many mistakes as he did, not be the worst guy in the league, not lose his job. He has the contract of a guy who's so good he's supposed to make up for other deficiencies on your team. That's why you're able to pay him that money. That's the, Donovan McNabb type thing, Stephen A., in Philadelphia. And when that guy is the worst starter in the league and loses his job, how do you even move that deal? They moved the deal and got a 3rd-round pick this season. I want to point out, they couldn't even get a 2nd-round pick this season. But they did get a 3rd, and they have a conditional 2nd-round pick where if Wentz doesn't lose his job in Indianapolis, they're going to wind up with a 1st. Of course they didn't lose the deal, Stephen A. They took a guy who's going to take this player and got a 3rd and a 2nd, potentially a 1st. That's a win.
I think you're completely wrong about this on several fronts. Number one, we don't know how good the Philadelphia Eagles are going to be because Jalen Hurts only completed 52% of his passes, and we don't know what kind of quarterback he's going to be. He wasn't lights out. He was 1-3 as a starter. He certainly showed potential. He certainly had big plays. Obviously, he's got wheels. He can move without the ball. He can run the football, and as a result, he galvanized the troops to some degree. But in the end, we don't know what the hell the Philadelphia Eagles are going to be, which is something we'll get into later. But let's look at the Indianapolis Colts. They were a top 10 offense and a top 10 defense. They lose a quarterback in Phil Rivers that threw for over 4,000 yards, 24 touchdowns and 11 interceptions, but he was a relatively stationary target, very immobile. He wasn't a threat to run the football against anybody. Got rid of the ball relatively quickly. We'll give him credit for that. But basically, he was on the tail end of his career, which is proof because he just retired. Having said all of that, what do you have? You have a running game led by Jonathan Taylor, who's a 1,000-yard rusher. You've got guys like T.Y. Hilton and Pittman Jr. and others that are good receivers. You have an offensive line that is considered elite. Even in a down year based on injuries, they were still a top 7 offensive line in the game. And Carson Wentz is coming from a team where he was sacked 50 times, a team that surrendered 65 sacks. That is the Philadelphia Eagles, albeit to some degree it was his fault because he held on to the ball too damn long. But clearly, anybody will tell you that the Eagles' offensive line was highly suspect, which is something even you pointed out before. They gave up 65 sacks last year, 50 at the hands of Carson Wentz. And he is going to a team that surrendered 19 sacks the entire season. Entire season. And I think they were one of the top teams in terms of hits allowed on their quarterback because it was like 32 or less, something around that number. This offensive line led by that monster, Quentin Nelson. I mean, this is who they are. They protect. They run block. They pass protect. This is what they do. And so when you look at it from that perspective and you look at the pieces that they have, and they were just in the playoffs, and then you look at the fact that Carson Wentz is being reunited with Frank Reich, the offensive coordinator in 2017. Last time they were together, which was 3 years ago, what did he do? They were 11-2, and Carson Wentz was an MVP candidate. I look at all of those things, and I say the Indianapolis Colts won with this because I don't expect Carson Wentz to go there and stink up the joint because he'll have a better coach. He'll be in a better situation. He'll be surrounded by better players. Okay, and I think as a result, he will resurrect his career to some degree anyway.
Yes or no answers. Let me ask you some questions. Is the Eagles' offensive line the Colts' offensive line?
No.
Does Frank Reich coach the Eagles?
Does he coach the Eagles? No, he coaches the Colts.
Right. So, like, that's the situation. But, right, the Eagles don't have that stuff. So even if you're right, I agree that you could take a flyer on Carson Wentz if you're the Colts because you do have if Carson Wentz can't make it work in Indianapolis, he can't make it work. But they have a reclamation project on their hands. They have a coach who believes he knows how to do it because he's worked with him before when he was very good. As you mentioned, they have an offensive line anchored by one of the best guards on the offensive line I've ever seen in Quentin Nelson. There's like a force field around him when he plays. No one can come within 10 yards of him, apparently, is the rule. Like, he is unbelievable, and that line is very good. You mentioned the running game. You mentioned a lot of stuff. The Eagles don't have those things. The Eagles don't have them, so Carson Wentz doesn't work there. He may not work in Indianapolis, but as you point out, they have a shot. But he doesn't work in Philly. So what did the Eagles wind up getting for a guy who simply doesn't work there? And by the way, divided the locker room, was talking to the press, or certainly whether or not he was leaking. I find it hard to believe he wasn't. When it would come out, Carson Wentz will demand a trade. He has no interest in being a backup. He'll want to trade if he's a backup to Hurts the day that Hurts is starting for the first time in the NFL. That kind of undermining influence in the locker room, in addition to a situation that doesn't work given the team, means the Eagles got to get rid of him. They got to get out from under that deal, right? So the fact that they were able to do it is one thing. The fact that if it works for the Colts, as you suggest it could, or that maybe even that is likely, the Eagles are going to get a third and a first? Oh, my God. I thought they were going to have to give up stuff to move that contract.
Why would they get a first? Why would they get a first?
Because it's a conditional second. The condition is, remember when we were joking about this yesterday, what are the conditions? The condition is, I think, 70 or 75% of the snaps. In other words, if Carson Wentz stays healthy and keeps the starting job, that second turns into a first. Mm-hmm. And even if it doesn't, a third and a second. So, Stephen A., even if they don't draft a quarterback, if they say, let's give Hurts a look for a year without a quarterback competition, maybe we'll just bring in a veteran starter to compete with Jalen Hurts, they still have draft capital to draft a quarterback next year if they want.
Yeah, but what you're doing is making the case that the Eagles are justified in letting go of Carson Wentz. Nobody's disagreeing with that. But when the question is being asked, are the Eagles losers in a Wentz trade, I'm comparing them to the benefit that the Colts get from it. And if the Colts get a starting quarterback who shines and leads them to the playoffs and potentially Super Bowl contention because they're one of the top teams in the AFC, then I consider that a win. Even though the Eagles were absolutely right in getting rid of Wentz because they don't have the personnel that the Indianapolis Colts have, it still doesn't negate the fact that the Colts ended up better off because they're going to be a better team. They're going to look better. They're going to be in the postseason, and they're going to have a quarterback who's aged 28 and moving forward because they got the right coach in place to coach him and the right organization led by Chris Ballard to oversee him.
I think that's
where you're answering the question.
Yep, you're betting on Wentz, and that's possible.
I'm betting on the Colts. I'm betting on the Colts.
Well, except that Wentz really does have, Reich and DiFilippo reportedly thought they needed to build him back up from the ground up.
Yeah.
So if they can
Doesn't
do
mean
that,
they're better off than the Colts.
If they
Not
can't, they're better off with Phillip Rivers.
There's an important note. There's an important note I want to mention before we close out here. The Eagles are now on the hook for $33 million. That's the biggest dead cap hit after trading a quarterback in NFL history.
Yeah.
I will leave you with that. We will discuss this a little bit later. Ryan Clark will join us. Wentz will no longer be in Philly. Max spending all the cash. So do the Eagles have the worst